Welcome to the Mission Minded Podcast. I am your host, Rachel Miller, and I have the privilege of leading this podcast with my best friend and co-host, Bella Comfort. Our mission is to fulfill the Great Commission by bringing our listeners closer to Jesus through each conversation. Now let's jump right in.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Mission Minded Podcast. We're so happy that you're listening. We're just going to dive right into it today with Dr. Einstein. And so last episode, we talked about what is the really real? What is real in this world that we live in? So today we are going to dive into what is the really real of humanity and what does it mean to be the pinnacle of God's creation. So getting started with that, Dr. Einstein, take us away.
Take us away. Last episode was a blast. So thank you for having me back and for doing this again. So yeah, just to recap that, the idea of the really real being, again, outside of the nature of science, outside of the nature of humanity, there was the Trinity interacting, saying, let us make. And so here we are. So I think that question is the next logical question then of what's it mean to be human? Why are we just hairless, tailless apes, right? Because there's an entire worldview that says good for us. Maybe dolphins are smarter than us, but we climbed our way to the top of the food chain. Here we are. Yay, humanity, right? Is that who we really want to think that we are? And honestly, a lot of people do think that, right? They've been in their paideia of this concept of the evolution. Now, yeah, there's a loaded word there that some episode we will flesh out. When I use the word evolution, I'll just say this. I mean from nothing, the circle we had here, to everything. Right? That when we use the word evolution in science, that's what we're referring to. We're not doing descent with modification, change over time, and all these. We want to kind of water that word. No. The word evolution as a scientist is, in the beginning there was nothing, and out of the nothingness, we have everything emerge, including the human mind. Okay. That's a tall tale that we have to explain, and we'll flesh some of the pieces of that out. But that word, so if that narrative is true for humanity, then yeah, there was nothing, and now here we are, good for us, right? Yay, humanity, because there's multiple, we get a verse and all this weird stuff. The question I want to address with the nature of humanity then is, well, what's the biblical narrative? What has been given to us from what I would call the actual user's manual of humanity, which is the Word of God, the written Word of God, the Bible itself. Yes, a 2,000-year-old book is completely 100% relevant in describing who we are and what's it mean to be human. So we talked about the Trinity. I'm not left-handed, so we will have to do this backwards. So you've got the Trinity. You've got Father, Son, Spirit, and the Father, Son, Spirit having perfect love, saying, "Let us make." Now here's what we need to realize. And one of the things that we're going to flesh out this episode, I hope, is the idea of the triads. And Rachel, I think you kind of alluded to it in episode 3 a little bit with the triad. Why triads? This idea of 3 and 1, 1 and 3. I have one triangle, but yet that triangle has 3 points to it. What does that mean? What is this triad? So let's start with maybe describing what that is. In Latin, there's an idea that's called omni trium perfectum, right? And you should just break those words down. They're just Latin, but omni, okay, everything, omni trium, everything that is of 3, perfectum. Everything that is of 3 is perfect. So within the idea of numerology, numbers mean something in the Hebrew worldview, and 3 was the idea of perfection. 2 is binary, 4 is redundant, 3 is perfect. So 3 is perfect. And think about your favorite story, just in life, like the favorite book, your favorite, you probably have a triad in there. You don't even realize it. Most really well-written stories are an interplay of a triad. One of the more classic one is Sherlock Holmes, right? Sir Conan Doyle's series on Sherlock Holmes. What you don't realize is going on there, and one of the reasons why it's such a beloved story is because that story is a triad. It's a triad of Sherlock, okay, we call him the protagonist, and the antagonist, Moriarty, or whoever the villain is, but the big antagonist there is Moriarty, because in the story he's close to the same intellect as Sherlock, so that you have this awesome. But that's just a binary relationship. That wouldn't be very exciting. So what's the triad to the story? You got it. And what does Watson do? Watson pulls out of Sherlock so much of his personality, his quirkiness. This guy is kind of eccentric. He can tell you how many stairs climbed up and all that weird stuff. And you have this beautiful interplay of a triad that brings the story to life. We're wired that way, right? So you have the protagonist, the antagonist. And by the way, you know what you call third person? Tritagonist, right? That's where that word comes from. So protagonist, antagonist, tritagonist, right? That story. And think of the humorous Nacho Libre, right?
Oh yeah,
right. One of my favorite. You've got Nacho, and he's got his antagonist, who in the movie never says a word, right? Right, Ramses. He never says a word, but he's the antagonist of the story. And who's the tritagonist in that? He's yes. Well, Nacho and then Steven, right? Esquialito. That banter between those two, you pull so much of Nacho because it's a humorous banter, right? Again, it's a triad. So this concept of triads woven through story, it's woven through science. We are wired for triads. We love, especially if we're a biochemist. Dr. Chase would love this. If we're a biochemist, we pretty much like to make everything three. DNA, right? RNA. You start to break those down, and it's like, well, yeah, all through biochemistry, those enzymes are typically a 3-letter abbreviation, right? We're wired for that. Think of government, CIA, FBI, DOD, USA. There's a wiring there that we love triads. Go to the Bible, Peter, James, and
John.
Faith, hope, and
love.
Okay, see how that works? Where there's a natural rhythm to triads. Go back to Jesus. Last episode, I am the
truth, and life.
Okay. What about the days of creation? How many days are there?
There were 3.
3.
And then 3.
3. And then he rested the 7th. How many pieces of armor are there?
3. And then
3, right? And that's why you get this concept of threes. We cannot escape it. Even your husband in engineering. Still our strongest practical, you could argue the circle is stronger, but practical is a triangle, right? You look at the rafters, if we could take that fake ceiling out, there's going to be triads up there. That's a strong engineering. We use that. You think of E equals MC squared, EMC, right? Even the nature of reality. Think of every single seed in the known world is a triad. Right? Every life came from a triad. As we were mentioning last episode, father, son, or father, mother, child. There's the triad. No matter where we go, we can't escape it. So when we see this 3 in 1, the very fabric of our reality is woven into the exact what we would expect if we came from a triune God. We shouldn't be able to escape the pattern of threes, and we can't.
Yeah.
It's woven into exactly who we are. So it would make sense as humans, being made in the image of God, that we would be a triad.
Wow.
Now, anything there before because this is where it gets, we have to define some terms here. So I don't know if want to keep going with that?
I feel like that's
clear
now.
Yeah. So here's where it gets a little bit messy growing up in churchology or churchianity. We have words like spirit, soul, heart, brain. What in the world are we talking about? Are they different? How do they differ? What's one versus the other? So we need to go back to go forward. And so with that, here's what I want to do. I want to go to 1 Thessalonians 5. If you go to 1 Thessalonians 5, and Rachel, you can read it for us. And Paul is basically going to explain at the very end of 1 Thessalonians 5. It's going to be 23 and through the 22, 23. Read that and see if you can articulate what Paul is saying here.
I think I'll start at 23.
Okay.
It says, now may the God of peace himself sanctify you completely, and may your whole spirit and soul and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ.
What did Paul just do? Where did he just break us down to?
3 threes.
We're a triad. You and I are triads. Does that surprise you if we were spoken into existence by a triad? Should. Which should be a natural order. You're made in the image of God. Now, we could talk about the image of God as in worship, and there's a lot of things with other things about that. But in our essence, in this ontological idea of what is our being, we are a triad. At the core of humanity, we are a triad. This is really important if we're going to figure out what in the world went wrong. we have to figure out who we are. Okay, again, go backwards to go forward. So when Paul breaks this down, he's breaking this down into a triad. Now, let me just ask you, I'll just throw this out there, just we had talked about this beforehand, so it's like a funny rhetorical question, but how many classes of beings do you think the Trinity created? If we're into this three thing, how many do you think there are? I'm going to go with three. Would that just I'm just going to spitball this one. There might be three. Great guess. Because biblically, there are three classes of created beings. Okay? You have the angelic world, right? This is what we call the unseen world. You can get into the divine council, and someday it'll be fun to do a podcast on angels, demons, and this whole idea, because we have, what are angels, what are demons? That's a really important thing. But those are a class of being. Okay, they have an ontology, if you will. Humanity, and then the third is going to be the animal kingdom, right? And the really cool thing is, in the perfect order in the garden, you had the interplay of the Trinity overseeing all three in perfection. You had the unseen, overseeing the seen, overseeing the animal, right? Our original mandate was to, right, subdue the garden, hang out with the animals, cultivate. It was beautiful. Everything was working in perfect harmony, and everything went south. And we'll have to talk about, the fall and all that kind of thing. So you have the perfect Trinity, Father, Son, Spirit, making humanity, making reality.
Yes.
And in reality, so you have three classes of being. So here's one class, here's another class, and here's a third class. Now notice they're slightly different. There's two. Okay. So notice they're slightly different. Three. That's kind of cool. Angels, or I should say the spiritual realm, the human realm, the animal realm.
And just so for people who are listening, there's two circles that are overlapping, and then there's three circles overlapping, and then two circles overlapping. So there's one set of three.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly. Perfect. Appreciate that, Rachel. So now, how did Paul break us down? He broke us down in 1 Thessalonians. He broke us down into body, soul, and spirit. All right. So we basically have a three-layered onion here: body, soul, and spirit. Again, triad. So we have body, we have soul, and we have spirit. So to go back to forward is, okay, well, what do we mean about soul? We're pretty comfortable with body, right? That's our carbon suits we live in, or electron suits, whatever you want. We're only looking at each other's electrons, but that's fine. but that's, that's what we are. Everything in this room is an electron that we're looking at. So we're living in these carbon suits. That's the body. Okay. So we are unique in creation. All of creation, we are the pinnacle of creation because we are unique. The animal kingdom was not in mind as let us make man. It didn't say let us make the animals in our likeness. Let us make the unseen realm in our likeness. It was let us make man, and I use that word generically. Let us make man in our image, right? Meaning humanity is unique because we're the triad. The animals aren't, and the angelic isn't. So this is what say again.
But God is.
But God is.
Yeah.
Right? Father, Spirit. John 1, God is Spirit, right? Son, particles, took on carbon suit. Amazing. And then spirit, right? So in this triad of humanity, we have body, soul, and spirit. Notice we have body, soul, and spirit. Now, this is what's really cool. Or body, soul, and we're going to break this down a lot as we go. You'll see this diagram. This is one of my favorite diagrams because it teaches so much.
I have it written in my Bible right
there. See, that's what I'm talking about. Right there. Because this isn't Einstein. This is Paul.
Yeah.
Paul is just helping us understand the concept around. Now, I would say this one quick misnomer with this, because I can hear my Hebrew friends already going, no, wait a minute, that's a very Greek thing. You just went Greek on us. It's not necessarily a Greek thing. It's also a Hebrew thing. Because even in the book of Hebrews, we're talking about the Word of God. The Logos is able to divide soul and spirit, body and soul, right? We know that the Rhema itself is strong enough, the Logos itself is strong enough to break the distinction between body and soul. And so we even see that in the Hebrew idea. So I would agree with that argument, or that person going, wow, that's a very Greek thing. we're still talking about a singular human entity, just like we're talking about a singular God. But in that oneness is a threeness. Just like in our oneness, we have a threeness. Okay, that's a really important concept, because you can't say to the Hebrew mind we're more holistic, we're all one. Paul's going Greek on us, so he's breaking this down. But we're able to teach aspects of the different characteristics of our humanity by breaking us down into a triad. And we'll get into why that's important down the road. But notice with just the difference between human and the spiritual realm and the animal realm. Notice the spiritual realm is missing one of the triads. They're not a triad. What piece logically are they missing? Body. Okay? So the angelic world, we'll call them the spirit, I don't get the spiritual world because this is spiritual, but we'll just call it spiritual world. The spirit beings, right, are soul and spirit. They just don't have carbon suits. Now, they could take on carbon suits, they could possess them, that's a whole other realm, but their actual creation was to just not be embodied in the way that we are, right? Jump over here to the animal kingdom. Well, what do you think the animal kingdom is missing? Spirit. I'll tell you this. So the spiritual world, they have a spirit and they have a soul. Trust me, we're going to see they have strong wills. Some good, some bad, but they have very strong wills. Okay, the will is part of the soul. Over in the animal kingdom, well, they have bodies. I know that because my cat has a really cute, fuzzy little body. And they have a strong soul, right? You ever train a horse or you ever train a dog? They have a soul. They have a desire to do what they want to do, right? That's part of the soul, which we'll break down. So you can see in the triuneness of humanity, this is why we're not animals. We are special. This is what cuts through and breaks the myth that the evolutionary narrative says we're just the highest animal because we've climbed the top of the food chain. No. The animal kingdom and the human kingdom are absolutely different ontologically. They're different as their very nature. The very being of animals, humans, and spiritual beings are very different in their creation. So it should make sense. Triune of God, 3 classes. This is us. Okay?
So what is the difference between soul and spirit?
Phenomenal. I love that. Okay, so, and this is why I said what those words, when we get into soul, we get into spirit, we get into heart. Old Testament uses the word heart a lot. So here's the cool thing. So,
Do we need to erase it?
Yeah, let's erase it, but we're going to do a real quick pause. So when you come back, that'll be good.
Yeah, I do want to make sure that, so those who are listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, I would recommend going to YouTube so you can see these images, because it really helps you understand truly what we're trying to get after. Sometimes you can hear it and you might I hope you get it through just our voices, but I would recommend definitely going to the YouTube and seeing this picture because it has been helpful for me.
Yeah.
Well, it was funny, I was going to pull up on my own Bible. I have the exact same diagram in my own Bible, and it keeps growing because the triads just keep growing, right? We'll get into this. So
the reason I asked this question is because the difference between soul and spirit, I guess in my head when I think about it, I think of animals being body and spirit, and then angelic beings obviously being spirit and soul, but then us, like this, basically the soul making us different than animals. But here it feels like it's the spirit, not the soul. So just like, I don't know, how do we define a difference?
Love it. Okay, perfect. So again, what do you mean by that? Let's go back to our triad. So I'm going to do it backwards this time. Okay, so out here we have our body. All right, again, this is our carbon suit, element number 6. Number 6. So this is body. Here, the next layer, if you will, again, all human. This is human. This is not animal. This is not angelic. The next layer of humanity is what we call our soul. Okay. Now this is your question. Because the inner layer here, the deepest layer, is our spirit. All right. And this is very important to flesh out. Because the soul, biblically, this is not Einstein's theology, this is biblically, the soul is broken down into, guess what?
A triad.
Does it surprise you? Again, this is all the reason why I love the patterns throughout Scripture. Do you guys remember how many temptations of Jesus there were?
3.
Yeah. You know why? Because he was tempted at the body level, the soul level, and the spirit level. He was also tempted within his soul at the 3 levels of the soul. They all overlap, which is, no surprise, right? You just start seeing this. All these ideas are the triads that we're going to break down. The soul is broken down into a triad. It's the mind, the will, and you're going to have it there, Rachel. I can see you shaking your head, and my emotions. Okay. So we are beings that think. And you guys have kids, you'll see that we're beings that have a will, right? And by the way, we learn this language of our will. Some of the very first words that we learn as children. Mine, no, stop. That's all learning that I've got a will. And we'll call that later down the road kingdom, but we'll see where that comes into this whole idea. And then we've got emotions, right? We know that. And the question is, don't be ruled by our emotions, but don't be an overthinker, you know, and breaking them. All these things we start to play with because this is us. This is us. This is who we are. So the soul then is this interface, if you will, to use a, you know, to use a computer word, you know, Isaac will run this, to use an interface. The soul then is an interface between what my body wants and then what this deeper part means, right? We're like almost like this, there's this almost like, you know, the bad angel, the good angel. There's this war, right? And down the road, we'll talk about the soul and the spirit, or the flesh and the spirit, right? Paul uses that throughout Galatians and Romans. And again, that's we have to integrate that in a different way. I don't want to do too much on this. But the soul being broken down into a triad, that middle layer is my mind, my will, and my emotions. The inner layer being the spirit, okay? Now, this is why you can say that animals, they have a soul. They think. They have a strong will, like I said, like a horse or a dog, right? I have a Aussie Doodle. She was a pretty easy little will to break. Very, very little obedient dog, but I still had to train her. And, you know, I'd argue their emotion. Now, I would argue my dog has emotions. I don't think my cat does, because, like, this is mad, this is sad, this is happy. You know, you just don't know with a cat, right?
My dog is so emotional. I feel like he's more emotional than we are. I feel like we're his support.
Yeah. Right? And they know that, right? My dog will, you know, my wife will, bless her heart, put a bag of trash out for me to put in the dumpster and set next to the dumpster, but of course not in the dumpster. And it'll sit there. And next morning I go out and, you know, my little dog Lucky's gone all through. It's all over the garage. You know, I go out and her little muzzle's all, you know, because she's gone through the pulled pork and everything that we had for dinner the night before. And she's looking at me and she knows, right? She knows she did something wrong. And she knows there's a penalty for that. You know, that's part of that. The animal kingdom has that, right? What they don't have is the deepest level that makes us different. So then the question naturally is, well, what then is here? This is where we're different. Now notice the spiritual realm. They don't have the carbon suit, but they have minds. Right? And when we get into the unseen realm, when we get into the divine council, you know, the Dr. Heiser idea of the divine council and the Nephilim and all these, and that's so important that we go through that as a worldview. They have a mind. They have a will. We're going to see that. Some chose to follow. Some chose to rebel. Right? They had a will. Right? Now, emotion, I don't know what emotion of an angel looks like, but they have that ability at that soul level. What they don't have is a body, but they have a spirit because they're spiritual. That's their being, right? That's who they are. So us being unique are again a triad. We're 3 and 1, 1 and 3. So here's the importance of understanding this. If we're going to understand what it looks like for humanity to be broken, we have to understand what humanity was to start with. Okay? Because oftentimes, as we were kind of laughing before this episode, I think oftentimes our experience in church is kind of a big giant bowl of spaghetti, right? And unfortunately, that noodle is a single noodle. And it is so wound in on itself and all around. You're like, how does this interrelate or interact with itself? Where do I start on the spaghettis? You know, and that's why I said in the previous episode that until we take the house and okay, what's the foundation on this? You know, the cornerstone being what's the really real, right? What's the next step up? Well, what's it mean to be human? Why do I even care about these questions? Which is the ontological argument of, well, if I can perceive of a being bigger than myself, there must be a being bigger. Now, like, I don't think it's the strongest of you know the reasons for God. But it is one of the classic reasons for God, the ontological argument for the existence of God. But if I understand this is the biblical understanding of humanity, what it means to be human. So much of our quote-unquote theology will become so much more practical, because when we start to delve into these big words like justification, what is Paul talking about? The whole book of Romans, the whole book of Galatians is about this concept of justification / righteousness. What in the world are you talking about? You won't understand that unless you first start with what Paul says about who we are, right? And so we have to understand the one of three and one of your humanity to understand how all of that interplays with, okay, what broke? What did Jesus do if he really fixed it? And why don't I feel fixed, right? Why don't I feel like things are, yay, everything's great? We have to talk about that. We have to flush that out, because as that big giant long noodle in that bowl, sometimes it gets frustrating. Sometimes it doesn't make sense because we're jumping in, and the pastor might jump in, 10 feet into the piece of noodle, and you're like, well, what about the first 9 feet of this thing? And what about the next 40? I don't understand where all this fits in. And to me, that's why that whole concept of going back to go forward, I want to undo this.
Yeah.
So that when we build a correct idea of humanity, let's build a correct idea of reality, really real. Now let's build on that a correct view of humanity, because now the fall is going to make sense. Because what broke? If in the garden you had the triune God presiding over the angelic beings, whatever that looks like, the angelic beings actually presiding over us, and then us presiding over the animal kingdom, that's perfection. And we called that, the Garden of Eden. That was perfection. It was the perfection of the councils all working together with the Father, Son, Spirit presiding over it. It was beautiful and perfect. We learned about that at church this morning, right? We saw that whole beautiful thing of the garden. And so with that idea, now we've got this concept of why we're different, what it means to be human. Now what do we do with it?
Wow, that's so helpful.
Yeah.
I appreciate you going through that, because this was one of the main images and pictures that I have had in my mind for a podcast, and what is truly, the foundation, and what I feel like I missed back in high school, back when granted, again, my mental space probably wasn't at the right capacity probably to understand it, but this was so influential for me to understand everything that I've learned now. And so I think that'll be helpful for a lot of people.
And Rachel, I'm with you on that. This isn't something that I came up with, right? I want to be really clear, because if I teach anything new that's not in the Bible, get out of here. Seriously, I am so serious. Get out of here. This is all stuff that the giants before us, the men and women that went before us, worked through, wrestled through. And so now what's going to happen when you see what Paul is talking about in the book of Hebrews and other places in the Word, Jesus being tempted at 3 levels, again, 3 and 3, things start to become really understandable, and these big church words begin to break down. And so if I say sanctification, you're going to be like, oh, okay, I see how that fits into this. Not, oh yeah, is that holy thing? And quit doing that and start doing that. We have the churchy concept, the churchianity concept of it. But Paul meant something by that. That word justification, that word sanctification, that word glorification, though they're big theological words, they're churchy words, they're really important. But now they're understandable practically through this lens, through this picture, right, that Paul gives us. And that's why, and because I don't, if you read Authentic Christianity, it's on your to-read list. And Stedman and Watchman and a couple of my favorite authors are the ones that use this because Paul used it, right? If Paul's going to use it, then I'm going to use it because it teaches. And so that's why it's been, and it's in your Bible, it's in my Bible. You go between Malachi and Matthew, the inner, that's where my picture is. That picture that I drew 30 years ago is in my Bible, and it's just amplified. Now I start to say, okay, what's the mind? Right. And then how does that, and then what's the will? And all this begins, and it starts to build, but starting with this picture, it goes out because it's so helpful to navigate that big strand of spaghetti that gets so confusing on Sunday morning, or even when I'm reading my own Bible. I'm plowing through Ephesians going, let's see, Jesus is the embodiment of everything that is. You're like, what is that even? It's so big I can't even understand it. But now I'm beginning, that's because he's referring back to the really real, right? John 1, in the beginning was the Logos. Why does John use Logos, right? Why does he use that word? Because the word, what's that mean? Why does he use that, right? And those concepts are all taught through a lens that's now teachable.
Yeah. And I definitely would like to have an episode almost on each part of that, because I know we could probably dive really deep into some of those as well. But did you have a question, Bella, that you were wanting to go into, or a verse?
I did, but I could.
Oh,
It was just just like thinking about everything we've just talked about. It reminded me of the verse, and I can't remember where exactly it's found, but talking about God, when he created us, he breathed his spirit into us, and how he breathed his spirit into us, but not the animals. And so that's kind of what like separates us from the animals, and then using that word spirit to distinguish the difference between the soul and the spirit too.
Yes. So see, it makes me excited, because you're connecting again a nice, probably something we all grew up with in church. Great sermon on, I want to say, Genesis 2. Breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being, right? Living soul. And okay, know what's going on. And what you made there was a perfect connection between God took dirt, right? Carbon, sulfur, phosphorus, nitrogen, oxygen, all my favorite, made us. But yet now we're just, we're just, the machinery is there, right? It's like saying, I'm going to take all the silicone, I'm going to take all the copper, I'm going to build this thing called a computer. Well, great. Is the computer any good yet? No. What do you have to do? Well, you have to breathe into it a bunch of ones and zeros. So you have the hardware, but a computer's not a computer unless you have the hardware and the software. What's the software? What's the software of humanity? Well, it's the spirit that animates, because we know scientifically and biochemically that the minute a person dies, the biochemistry is exactly the same. In fact, oftentimes after whatever's gone, call it the spirit leaving, the person's biochemistry is still going on. Brainwaves, and people have talked about, the arm lifting up at the morgue. There's still things going on within because again, the machinery is there that it still has some vestigial of the way it's supposed to work, but it's not a person because something's missing. Question is, what's missing? Well, it's going to be the life part of that. Again, the totality of this, and that middle, that inner person, that inner thing that animates the person's gone, and that's going to be that software. So when the Lord breathes into them, the nefesh, breathe this life thing into humanity, it's him breathing life into it. His presence now animating us. Now that's a beautiful way to wrap this one up.
Yeah.
Because that makes us the Adam and Eve, the perfect creation. They were perfect. Body, soul, spirit. They were created to have his presence within him. Okay? So animal, like you said, animals weren't. It wasn't said that he breathed in the elephants, the breath of life. No, he made them. They were animated. They're out there eating the grass, and the ants are doing their thing, and they're all symbiotic. There's this perfect harmony. We're different. Here he fashions us, breathes life, his presence into us. Now we're animated, Adam, and become Adam and Eve.
Yeah. Yeah, and that makes me kind of think about the concept of like, we all have a God-shaped hole inside of us, and how like that spirit that is like the deepest part of us, it was breathed from God. So when we try to fill it with things that aren't of God, money, drugs, sex, like anything like that, it doesn't fill us, because that spirit came from God, and it can only be fulfilled in us from God. And so like, so many of us are having identity crisis in our world, because like we're looking for that spirit, the end, like, I don't know, the fulfillment of that spirit with other things that aren't from the spirit.
Yeah. And that, we use words growing up like the God-shaped hole and all this, and we're like I said, we're trying to fill it with all those things, and you wonder, okay, why was the alcohol on Friday night not enough? Right? Why do I have to then go back to it on Saturday and then go back to it on? Okay, well, and this goes back to what C.S. Lewis says. He says, well, if nothing in this world can ultimately satisfy me, maybe I really wasn't made for this world.
Right.
Maybe there really isn't anything in this world that is going to satisfy me. And that was the aha for him. It's like, well, wait a minute. In his book, Surprised by Joy, there was something bigger outside of myself. And I realized, okay. All right. This Jesus thing, it might be real. Right. And he's heading off to Oxford, and anyway, it's this whole beautiful story. And I think that for our listeners and for us to go forward, I think that to understand just the basic concepts of, there's something that we're trying to fill this with. There's a longing deep within me that I do. I mean, I may be crave from my dad, or crave from my mom, crave from my work, right? My image, or what, the things you use, like, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? Like the good old 80s, right? David Lee Roth. With that idea of trying to fill that, then probably we should go and look at then what happened. If the original creation was perfect, if you have Adam and Eve walking in the coolness of the garden, you have the angelic realm over them, you have them over this, they said be fruitful, multiply, and so, they're supposed to be a triad now, and then a triad, and have humanity, and then new triads, and the beautiful filling of this one went wrong.
Yeah, right.
Why is our world the way it is?
Yeah.
Right. Why
at the fall?
Yeah. What happens at the fall? Why does my dad drown when I'm 17? You're like, what? Okay, what's going on? And it gets into that whole thing of, okay, I kind of get a picture, but that doesn't explain the tension I feel in my soul as to something's really messed up.
Yeah.
There's still something inside of me.
Right.
It wants to kind of do its own thing, right? I want to go that way, not that way. Why is that there? Where does that come from? Well, why, if this is such a beautiful picture, if Jesus comes, takes residence, good to go.
Yeah.
Why isn't it good
Why
to
isn't
go?
everything great?
Yeah. And that was one of the things that's frustrating to me growing up in the church, right? And part of my story was, well, I became a great faker, right? I just smile, everything's great. But in the core of me, I'm like, yeah, this is all messed up, right? I can go through the motions. I can go on Sunday morning, do the dog and pony show, and raise my hands and sing and open my Bible and leave and really be me, right? Well, why? What is that? What's that? What am I missing? What was I missing Sunday morning? And if this is the right picture, how do I fix that? How do we take this picture that Paul beautifully portrays in 1 Thessalonians 5 and make that now a working model of reality that leads to the most important question that I've asked myself is, where does abundant life come from?
Yeah.
Then, as you remember, I think it was episode 2, we talked about that John 10:10 verse is frustrating. Because if Jesus says, I've come to give you life and give it to you abundantly, what in the world are you talking about? Where is this abundant life there?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
When we get up in the morning, and do I feel abundant? Do I feel like, oh yeah, I'm so, what's missing? And how do we pragmatically walk through this idea of humanity was broken. Jesus said he fixed it. So what's the fixing look like? How do we work that out? How do we live that out? Why are we different than, as I think it was you that said, than the other religions, quote unquote,
Right.
that have other concepts of God, right? And why are we set apart differently? Why are we the only religion that says God came from there to here? All other religions say we go from there to there, from here to there. We're actually completely opposite of all of the world religions. Well, then what in the world's going on, right? We don't ascend to Godhood. God descended to our level.
Right.
That makes us very different. Okay, so if that's true, how does that work?
Right.
What does that mean practically, day by day? And what does that mean on Monday morning, right? Because we're sitting here on a Sunday afternoon after a wonderful sermon by Pastor Tim, and we're like, it was fun talking about heaven, fun talking about I could see my dad someday, right? But Monday morning's coming.
Right.
And how do I not just have that camp high, that Sunday morning high? Sunday morning should look the same as Thursday.
Yeah.
Right? And I should be just looking for Friday night, right? Every day should be the same day. If I understand what Paul is really teaching throughout the totality of the New Testament, which is really a fulfillment of the Old Testament. And so maybe we should flesh out, okay, then what went wrong?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I think that's a great way to wrap up this episode. And then also next episode, maybe we can talk about the road from justification to sanctification too, because...
Or just justification itself.
Right.
What is that word?
Right.
Holy mackerel. Yeah, big church word. That, what? You drop that just... And as you guys know me, I don't like big theological words.
And so do a lot of other people. Because they're confusing.
Yeah.
And it makes a lot of people stop pursuing Jesus because it is confusing and it's hard to understand. And so my hope is that we can break those down enough to make it easier and simple. Like you're saying, Jesus is simple, so that it reignites people's love for the Lord. And I'm just so glad that you guys talked about that. It gave me chills when you said that, because I was like, it's true. Like, that hole in our heart is the Spirit, and that so many people are longing for, but they don't know. And so I want people to know that. So that's the mission of this podcast. I'm so excited for the next episode now.
Well, you heard it here first. Rachel's excited. So you'll have to join us for our next podcast. See you guys later.